And I also want to welcome you to the first of our short series this fall of talks. Veronica's kindly put up a kind of preliminary poster with the information about the remaining 2 talks, one in November and one in early December, just before classes end. We hope to do more of these. I'm sorry about the lack of lunch and the lack of ice cream, but there's a promissory note that those 2 will happen. But I wanted to thank Cheryl, who's agreed to introduce the talk today, and turn it over to you. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, well, it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Blackburn. So Andrea is a 6th-year graduate student now in our department. She's already quite the research career before she came to BU. She went to Miami University, and while she was there, she actually took was part of a special course in Cambridge. She spent a semester at Cambridge University and studying primatology with W.C. McGrew there, and other courses in biological anthropology. And that was quite a prestigious program that she participated in, and sort of selected to join that. She also took the Madeiras field course in tropical biology after that, and it was 2013. And then in 2015, she spent a year in central Kalimantan working as a research assistant for Aaron Vogel at the Tuanan research site, studying orangutans there, and also helping out one of the graduate students there. And kind of, I think probably that was your most extensive early experience with seed dispersal, because you also did a lot of seed dispersal work there. So Andrea is an expert, as we'll hear, all about seed dispersal in orangutans and other primates. She's also very adept at using GIS and has a pretty advanced expertise at that in analyzing our data. She's been working with a Europe student with Victoria Zdanowicz the last year or so, well, particularly since the summer, in helping her work on a project analyzing data. So she's well on her way to finish up her PhD, and very eager to hear about her talk. So her title today is Frugivory, Seed Dispersal, and Dispersal Distances by Bornean Orangutans.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was very nice. And thank you all so much for coming today. Go ahead and share my screen. So can you all see the talk well enough?
Yep.
All right. So like Cheryl said, my talk is on frugivory, seed dispersal, and dispersal distances by Bornean orangutans. So seed dispersal is the movement or spread of seeds away from the parent plant. And in order for plants to move their seeds, which contain their genetic material, into new locations, plants use vectors. Some plants use abiotic vectors, such as wind, water, or gravity, to move their seeds, but the majority of plants in tropical forests rely on animal vectors. Animals can disperse seeds several ways, including consuming fruit and seeds, or by seeds attaching to feet, fur, or feathers. And plants entice animals to disperse seeds by producing fruits, and animals that consume fruits are known as frugivores. Examples of well-studied frugivores, seed dispersers, include primates, birds, and bats. So animal behavior can shape how, when, and where seeds are dispersed, and consequently, if these seeds are dispersed to areas with suitable conditions for these seeds to successfully establish and become adult plants. And many factors can influence seed dispersal. As such, there's variation at every stage of seed dispersal. And I'll briefly outline some of the ways in which animal behavior influences seed dispersal. So for example, if we have a plant that is producing fruit, how an animal decides to consume the fruit can affect seed dispersal. Instead of swallowing seeds, an animal may decide to chew up the seeds, thereby ending the process of seed dispersal at the plant. And seeds are often high in fat and calories, and so this can be a highly rewarding food source. Other times, the animal may only consume the pulp of the fruit and then discard the seeds rather than swallowing them. The behavior of how an animal consumes a fruit, known as fruit handling behavior, can shape seed dispersal outcomes. For example, does the animal swallow the seeds, spit out the seeds, or predate or chew the seeds? In other words, does a frugivore enhance or destroy the seed's chances of survival? Other behaviors can also shape the importance of animal seed dispersal contribution. For example, how many fruits the frugivore consumes during a feeding bout, or how far the frugivore travels after swallowing seeds. Some seeds might not be dispersed long distances, as the animal might spit out or discard the seeds underneath the tree crown. Seeds underneath the tree crown have a high probability of mortality, and so in order to improve seed survivorship, seeds need to be dispersed out from underneath the parent tree crown. And infrequently, seeds are also dispersed very long distances or even across habitat types. These seeds might colonize new areas and expand the ranges of plant populations. Frugivore movement and behavior shapes how far from the initial fruit source or parent tree the seed is dispersed. Additionally, the conditions where the seed lands can also affect seed survivorship. Once dispersed, if the conditions are appropriate, germination may occur, and finally, establishment may occur. This is where a germinating seed takes root. And one way to measure the effect an animal disperser has on seed dispersal is to use the seed dispersal effectiveness framework, which measures the effectiveness of a disperser. The seed dispersal effectiveness framework combines the quantity of seeds dispersed with the quality of dispersal. Primates are known frugivores, as most all primates consume some fruit, and many disperse seeds. Primates represent between 25 to 40% of the frugivore biomass in the tropics, suggesting that primate seed dispersal contributions are impactful. Unlike smaller frugivores, primates can often disperse large-sized seeds due to their large body sizes. Additionally, primates have high manual dexterity, allowing them to manipulate hard-husked fruits. So often primates have important and unique seed dispersal roles. So orangutans are highly frugivorous, preferring fruit over other food types. Important for our understanding of orangutan seed dispersal is to know how frequently the seeds of these fruits orangutans consumes are being dispersed, or if these seeds are being predated. Orangutans move on average 800 meters to a kilometer each day, and orangutans also have long gut passage durations, or gut retention times. Captive studies have measured mean gut retention times, which is the duration until half of the swallowed seeds are defecated, ranging anywhere from 41 to 146 hours. So we predict orangutans are dispersing seeds far distances from the parent trees because of these long dispersal, these long daily path lengths combined with these lengthy gut retention times. And so seed dispersal distances are important as they influence plant establishment at different spatial scales. And my research is investigating the orangutan's role as a seed disperser and as a seed predator by measuring orangutans' patterns of frugivory. And in terms of the orangutan seed dispersal role, my research measures how far orangutans are dispersing seeds and the quantity and diversity of seeds the orangutans are dispersing. So orangutans are semi-solitary, and individuals usually forage and travel alone or in mother-offspring pairs. Orangutans are relatively unique in that male orangutans undergo bimaturism, in which there are two sexually mature adult male morphs. Unflanged males are smaller in body size and have no cheek flanges or throat sacs and tend to be less preferred by females. Flanged males are larger in body size, have prominent cheek flanges, produce long calls via throat sac, and are generally preferred by females. So the photos on the right from top to bottom represent a mother and offspring pair, an unflanged male, and a flanged male. Orangutan age sex classes exhibit different foraging and reproductive strategies, evidenced by differences in feeding behavior and activity budgets. So for example, flanged males have been shown to have longer feeding bouts, consume more vegetative material, and consume harder fruits, including more seeds and unripe fruits than females. Flanged males are also approximately twice the size of adult females, suggesting flanged males endure greater energetic costs than females. However, female orangutans incur energetically expensive reproductive costs associated with pregnancy, lactation, and carrying of infants. Unflanged males, while similar in body size to adult females, do not experience these reproductive costs. Due to physiological differences in body size and reproduction, orangutans' age sex classes have different nutritional and metabolic requirements, which influence their ranging and foraging decisions. So orangutans consume a wide variety of fruit types and fruit sizes, and I've included some photos here so you can see the diversity of fruits they consume. Orangutans are also selective about which parts of the fruits they consume. As fruit parts differ in nutritional quality, for example, seeds tend to be high in calories and lipids, whereas fruit pulp tends to be high in sugars. So like most primates, orangutans use a mixture of behaviors when they consume a fruit. Different feeding behaviors can have varying effects on the fitness of plants they consume. So seed swallowing and seed spitting are both types of seed dispersal, where seed predation destroys a seed's chances of survival. Because of the orangutan's role as a seed predator and a seed disperser, we consider orangutans' roles not as a dichotomy, but falling somewhere on a mutualist-antagonist continuum, as orangutan seed dispersal is not always entirely mutualistic or entirely antagonistic. So here's an example of fruit handling behavior in which bland male Alfred is choosing to feed on the pulp and skin of Physium fruits, and he's notably spitting out the seeds directly below him. And he also has a rather gruesome lip injury. So Southeast Asian forests are dominated by the plant family Dipterocarpaceae, and these forests have dramatic fluctuations in fruiting and flowering events. Infrequent periods of high fruit availability, known as mass fruitings, occur frequently, approximately once every 2 to 7 years. The rest of the time, fruit is relatively scarce. Orangutans tend to prefer fruit over other fruit types due to the high caloric returns, so during periods of high fruit availability, orangutans at our research site, Gunung Palung, consist of 100% fruit, whereas during periods of low fruit availability, orangutan diets may consist of only 21% fruit. Additionally, orangutans' ranging patterns fluctuate in response to fruit availability. In both masking and non-masking forests, orangutans increase their daily travel distance with increased fruit availability. So for our research questions, we sought to understand the quantity and diversity of seeds orangutans disperse. So we asked, how many seeds are orangutans dispersing? How many genera of seeds orangutans are dispersing? How often do orangutans disperse seeds in fecal samples? And how do orangutans compare with other ape seed dispersers? Next, we investigated how often orangutans are dispersing seeds and how often orangutans are predating seeds by researching how often orangutans are engaging in different fruit handling behaviors. Next, we wanted to understand which fruits orangutans are most effectively dispersing. So for this question, we constructed a mutualism-antagonism continuum of orangutan seed disperser and seed predator behavior. We plotted this continuum against orangutan fruit preference, and then using the seed dispersal effectiveness framework, we identified the most effectively dispersed fruits by orangutans. Lastly, we asked how far orangutans dispersing seeds, and is there significant variation in seed dispersal distances based on food availability, age, sex class, or gut retention time. So we predicted that longer gut retention times would be associated with longer dispersal distances, that fruit availability, as it increased, would be associated with longer seed dispersal distances, and that there would be differences in seed dispersal distances among orangutan age, sex class. We also investigated if there were long seed dispersal events, or if orangutans were dispersing seeds across habitat types. So our study site is the Chavangpanti Research Station in Gunung Palung National Park, West Kalimantan, Indonesia. The map pictured here of the study site shows the trail system and the different habitat types. There are at least 7 distinct habitat types within the study area, and each habitat type is unique in forest structure, plant composition, soil type, phenology, and elevation. Orangutans were rarely followed in the habitat types in the upper elevations, particularly the lowland granite, upper granite, and montane, and orangutans were followed until about 250 meters outside of the trail system. Fruit, flower, and leaf availability were also measured monthly in 60 plots and belts throughout the different habitat types, and fruit availability was measured as a % of fruiting stems. So in order to compare seed dispersal distances with variation in fruit availability, monthly % fruit availability was converted into z-scores. So data were collected at the Chavangpanti Research Station, and this research station has been collecting data on wild orangutans for over 25 years. Individual orangutans are followed from their morning nest until they're asleep in their night nest. And so while following the orangutan, we collect feeding data, and feeding data include the food type, the genus, the part of the food item consumed, the number of fruits consumed per minute, crop size, and tree diameter and tree height. We also recorded videos of feeding behavior, like the one you saw earlier. And so to measure orangutan fruit handling behavior, I observed how orangutans handled the seeds in fruit. I observed if orangutans swallowed, predated, or spit seeds, or if a combination of handling behaviors were used. I collected data on fruit handling behaviors from direct observation and videos from August 2018 to March 2020. As part of my study, we systematically collected all orangutan fecal samples, including those opportunistically collected from orangutans associating with our focal individual study. We also recorded the percent of the fecal sample collected. We also collected GPS tracks. An observer beneath the orangutan recorded a continuous GPS track on a handheld GPS unit. Continuous GPS tracks have been collected since 2013. We aim to follow each focal orangutan for at least 5 consecutive days, and we use the term follow series to account for multiple days of following the same focal orangutan. As not all follow series lasted 5 days, we recorded the reason why a follow series lasted less than this duration. And there were 2 categories of reasons as to why orangutans were not followed for the full 5 days. So first, the orangutans were purposely not followed for the full duration, and this might be because there were not enough researchers available to follow that individual, or other resource constraints. Second, the reasons why we didn't follow might have been due to the orangutan's behavior, and if the orangutan's behavior was the reason why we lost them, this was considered a lost follow series. And this might have been the orangutan traveled too far and too quickly and was lost during the follow, they moved too far outside of the study area, or if they moved outside of the nest during the night. So for our data collection, we collected 733 orangutan fecal samples throughout our 20-month study, of which at least 85% of the fecal sample was collected for 401 samples. To ensure sample completeness, we used this subset of 401 samples for our analyses. Fecal samples were collected and brought to the field station, and samples were sieved in order to identify seeds. All seeds were identified to the genus level with the assistance of foreign and local experts in Indonesian botany, and with the help of a database of plants consumed by orangutans. All seeds greater than 2 millimeters in length were counted, otherwise we recorded the presence or absence of seeds. Samples were collected from 32 different individuals. Adult and adolescent females were the most frequently followed, and this age sex class comprises the majority of sample collection. We collected the least number of fecal samples from unplanned and adolescent males, who are notoriously difficult to follow. So I observed orangutan's fruit handling behavior for 53 genera. I recorded if orangutans swallowed, predated, or spat the seeds in each fruit, or if they used multiple fruit handling behaviors. We also recorded the fruit types. Next, we combined long-term feeding data with long-term phenology data to calculate IVLO's selectivity index. An IVLO selectivity index is an index of foraging selectivity, and it compares resource availability to resource consumption. So we calculated IVLO's selectivity index by comparing the mean number of fruits available per genus each month using the phenology data set. This was our measure of resource availability, to the mean number of fruits orangutans consume per genus each month throughout the same 6-year time frame using our long-term feeding data set. This was our measure of resource use. So in all, we had fruit handling behavior data, feeding data, and phenology data for 39 genera of fruit. We were then able to create a mutualism antagonism landscape, plotting fruit handling behavior, this is the proportion of fruits dispersed versus predated, against IVLO's selectivity index. And we use this landscape to identify which seeds orangutans are most effectively dispersing. The most effectively dispersed seeds and fruits are the ones that orangutans are consuming more often relative to abundance, and the seeds are being dispersed rather than predated. We modeled orangutan seed dispersal distances using GPS tracks. Based on our feeding data and seed dispersal data, we identified a feeding bout in which the focal orangutan was likely swallowing seeds. We only used one feeding bout per follow series to ensure independence of sampling. We then identified the orangutan's location 45, 60, 80, and 125 hours after that feeding bout. These durations were selected based on captive measures of orangutan gut passage times. Captive studies have recorded a wide range of variation in orangutan gut passage times, and so we selected multiple values to represent this variation in our model. Next, we measured the direct distance between the feeding bout and the orangutan's location after the durations of gut passage. Our figure provides an example of orangutan movement track, in which each dot represents the orangutan's location every 2 minutes. And so in this example, the distance the seed would have traveled after 45 hours is 744 meters. Next, we investigated which variables predicted orangutan seed dispersal distances. So for these analyses, we fitted generalized linear models in R of orangutan seed dispersal distances with predictor variables. We then compared our glens to one another and a null model. So our first set of statistical models asked if gut retention time predicted seed dispersal distances. Our next set of statistical models compared the glens of orangutan seed dispersal distances for each of the gut passage durations 45, 60, 80, and 125 hours. Our predictor variables were fruit availability, as Z-scores, orangutan sex, so unplanged males, planged males, and females, and follow series type, lost and not lost. So by considering follow series type, this allowed us to test if lost follow series indicated instances of quick directed travel over far distances, likely corresponding to long dispersal distances. Lost follow series were those that did not last for more than 4 full consecutive days due to the orangutan's behavior. So for example, unplanged males are difficult to follow, they often travel quickly and far, and regularly leave the study area. We projected that lost follow series might be associated with longer seed dispersal distances, as the orangutan's movement may be faster, more directed over longer distances. So follow series types were only included in the models for 45 and 60-hour dispersal distances, as there were too few lost follow series for 80 and none for 125-hour dispersal distances. We also considered orangutans' habituation status. Out of the 121 follow series we analyzed, only 6 were considered unhabituated follow series. So we do not think unhabituated orangutans were more likely to be lost or that they affected these results. So on to the results. We found that orangutans dispersed a total of 27 genera via defecation and 29 genera via spitting. Seeds were recorded in 71.8% of fecal samples, and seeds smaller than 2 millimeters were recorded in 10% of fecal samples, and large seeds, those larger than 10 millimeters in length, were recorded in 54.1% of fecal samples. Orangutans dispersed an average of 27.9 seeds per fecal sample and a mean of 1.4 genera per fecal sample. All age sex classes of orangutans, excluding very young infants, defecated intact seeds. So to provide context to these results, we're going to compare these with other apes. So orangutans disperse seeds in 71.8% of fecal samples, and this falls just below the low end of gorilla and chimpanzee seed dispersal frequencies. And orangutans disperse seeds much less frequently than gibbons and bonobos. Orangutans dispersed a mean of 27.9 seeds per fecal sample, and this is less than gorillas, but falls within the range of chimpanzees' number of seeds per fecal sample. Not surprisingly, orangutans disperse more seeds per fecal sample than small-bodied gibbons. And finally, orangutans disperse an average of 1.4 genera per fecal sample. All the other apes disperse a greater number of species per fecal sample, but since this is a comparison of genera with species, a mean of 1.4 genera is likely an underestimate of the number of species, so these numbers might actually be fairly comparable. So orangutans appear to be dispersing seeds on the lower end when compared to other apes, and to further investigate this, we next considered how orangutans' fruit handling behavior and patterns of frugivory shape their seed dispersal role. So I observed fruit handling behavior of fruits during feeding bouts for 53 genera. So seeds in a given fruit were observed to see if they were swallowed, predated, spit, or if a combination of behaviors were used per fruit. So this figure shows what proportion of fruit per genus were subject to each handling behavior, and then ordered based on fruit type. So the fruit handling behavior that occurred most frequently for each genus was considered the predominant form of fruit handling behavior. So based on the proportion of time each handling behavior occurred. So for example, for the genus Orangutan, this is a fruit that's a drupe. Swallowing occurred the greatest proportion of time, and so swallowing was considered the predominant handling behavior for this genus, but other handling behaviors were also used. So we observed differences in fruit handling behavior based on fruit type. Nuts, legumes, and aggregate fruits tended to be predated, whereas berries, drupes, and capsules tended to be dispersed via spitting or swallowing. So orangutans predominantly spat out 18 genera, swallowed 9 genera, predated 25 genera, and used a mixed combination of behaviors for one genus, and this was ficus. So our food handling behavior data corresponds to 88% of the total time orangutans consume fruit in our long-term feeding database. We use the predominant form of fruit handling behavior for each genus to calculate what % of time orangutans engage in each fruit handling behavior out of the total time spent consuming fruit. We found orangutans spent most of their time predating seeds, 42% of the fruit feeding time, followed by seed spitting, about 21 to 22% of the fruit feeding time, then seed swallowing, 13.5% of their time spent feeding on fruit, and lastly, mixed handling behavior comprised the least amount of time, though this was only recorded for one genus, and so 10% of the time spent feeding on ficus is actually quite a lot. And then the remaining fruit feeding time consisted of about 12%, and this we did not have handling behavior to correlate with this. So this is our seed dispersal effectiveness landscape. The mutualism antagonism continuum is the y-axis, and this represents the proportion of fruits dispersed versus predated based on fruit handling behavior observations. So here, seed dispersal considers both seed spitting or seed swallowing. The x-axis represents fruit preference based on iLove selectivity index. In this, a score of 0 suggests the fruit is least preferred, 1 is neutral preference, and 2 is preferred. Fruit genera are grouped by fruit type, and fruits are colored based on the predominant handling behavior. The most effectively dispersed genera, those in the top upper right-hand corner, are Tetramerista and Elangium. These are both preferred, and a high proportion of these fruits are dispersed. The top 5 most preferred fruits, according to iLove selectivity index, are all highly predated, and these are the fruits in the lower right-hand corner. So overall, seed swallowing was orangutan's predominant seed handling behavior for 9 genera via swallowing, accounting for about 13.5% of their total time spent feeding on fruit. Seed spitting was more common than seed swallowing, and spat seeds for 18 genera, about 22% of their fruit feeding time. When compared to other apes, orangutans disperse seeds relatively less frequently, on only about 72% of fecal samples, and orangutans seem to be engaging in seed dispersal via seed spitting, which is observed less frequently in the other apes. Elangium and Tetramerista were the most effectively dispersed. For these 2 genera, the fruits were consistently and frequently dispersed, and the fruits were highly consumed by orangutans relative to their abundance. We also found that of the different fruit types, orangutans dispersed berries, drupes, and capsules. In our electivity analysis, we identified ficus as an important fallback food. This genera is consistently available in the forest, and when preferred foods are not readily available, orangutans will consume large quantities of figs. Ficus accounts for approximately 10% of the entire time orangutans spend consuming fruit. But according to iLove selectivity analysis, this genus was not preferred, which is why we consider this fruit to be an important fallback food for orangutans. Orangutans use a mixture of handling behaviors to disperse ficus. During feeding bouts, they often spit out many of the very small seeds, but we still find hundreds and thousands of ficus seeds in their fecal samples. And so the next parts of my research, not presented here today, will address what factors influence the frequency of orangutan seed dispersal and what is the fate of orangutan dispersed seeds. Orangutans are also seed predators. Seed predation was orangutan's predominant seed handling behavior, and this occurred for 25 genera, and this was more genera than orangutans predominantly spat or swallowed. And predation accounts for about 42% of their fruit feeding time. In addition, the top 5 most preferred fruits, those identified by the electivity analysis, were all highly predated. And orangutans primarily predated nuts, legumes, and aggregate fruits. Orangutans' seed predation and seed dispersal are not dichotomous. For example, we found orangutans dispersing Diosporo seeds, even though orangutans predominantly predated these seeds. So infrequent seed dispersal of commonly predated fruits may outweigh the fitness cost of predation. So now on to our results on orangutan seed dispersal distances. According to our dispersal distance modeling, orangutans dispersed on average seeds between 450 and 600 meters. At a gut retention time of 45 hours, seeds were dispersed mean distances of 465 meters. And the longest mean dispersal distances were about 600 meters at the 125-hour gut retention time. Maximum seed dispersal distances were over 2.2 kilometers. So orangutans are occasionally dispersing seeds long distances. And orangutans moved at least 85% of seeds more than 100 meters from the parent tree across all 4 gut retention times. So surprisingly, gut retention time was not a predictor of dispersal distance. Across all 4 gut retention times, dispersal distances remain similar. So while the shortest mean dispersal distance from the chart I just showed you was at a gut retention time of 45 hours, and the longest mean dispersal distances were at the 125-hour gut retention time, there was not a statistically significant difference. And the plot here shows the density curves for dispersal distances for each of the 4 gut retention times. And you can see that the curves are almost identical. We found that orangutan sex was not a predictor of dispersal distances, contrary to our predictions. None of the orangutan sexes were dispersing seeds significantly longer or shorter distances than the others, although our sample size on planged males was small. Seeds were dispersed farther during lost follows than non-lost follows. During lost follow series, seeds were dispersed 44.3% further than not lost follow series at the 45-hour gut retention time. The mean distances seeds were dispersed during lost follow series at 45 hours was 622 meters, and at 60 hours, during lost follow series, seeds were dispersed mean distances of 845 meters. So contrast with the not lost follow series, mean dispersal distances were 431 meters at 45 hours and 491 meters at 60 hours. So this box and whisker plot here shows dispersal distances at 45 hours in the top plot and 60 hours in the bottom plot, and depicts dispersal distances between males in blue and females in red, and between lost and not lost follow series. So both males and females seem to be driving these long dispersal distances, particularly notable at the 60 hours. Again, contrary to our predictions, fruit availability was not a predictor of dispersal distances. In these graphs, we plotted dispersal distances for the gut passage durations: 45 hours in the top left, 60 hours in the top right, 80 hours in the bottom left, and 125 hours in the bottom right. And these were plotted against fruit availability at z-scores. And no strong correlations emerged. Although one limitation of our study was that we had few follow series that occurred during high periods of fruit availability. Perhaps a larger sample size of dispersal distances at the highest peaks of fruit availability might reveal a different pattern. And then in our models of orangutan seed dispersal distances, we asked if seeds were dispersed across habitats, and we found that seeds were dispersed from one habitat into another in 32 to 49% of dispersal events. We also modeled the number of seed dispersal occurrences within and between habitat types. And the lowland sandstone forest had significantly higher odds of being an initial habitat than a post-dispersal habitat. Orangutans were more likely to consume fruit in the lowland sandstone forest habitat than the other habitat types. Orangutans consume fruit and disperse seeds most often in the lowland sandstone habitat, followed by the freshwater swamp, then the alluvial bench, and then the feed swamp. So orangutans disperse seeds mean distances of about 450 to 600 meters, and this was not influenced by orangutan sex or fruit availability. At least 85% of the seeds were moved at least 100 meters from the parent tree, escaping the area of high seed mortality underneath the parent tree ground. There were long seed dispersal events, and these dispersal events were mediated by both male and female orangutans, particularly during lost follow series. Orangutans disperse seeds across habitats at Changwangpanti, and the other primate frugivores at the site, particularly the gibbons and macaques, are territorial, and so there might be limited opportunities for these primates to disperse seeds across habitat types. So that might be where the orangutan's dispersal role diverges from these other primates. Seeds dispersed across habitat types could expand plant population ranges, colonize new sites, and maintain gene flow. On the other hand, there might not be suitable sites for seed recruitment due to habitat differences. Some previous research has shown that habitat type can constrain plant recruitment, and many tropical plants grow only in particular habitats. So dispersal across habitat types could be positive or negative for seed dispersal. And so similar to previous literature, we've shown that orangutans are seed predators. Orangutans exhibit adaptations for the consumption of hard and tough food objects, including seeds. Adaptations include thick crenulated molar enamel, strong jaws, which are suggested to enhance orangutans' ability to domesticate and chew seeds and other hard objects. Seed predation is also an important ecological role. Seed predation itself affects plant demography, and it shapes plant population growth, plant abundance, and plant distributions. Seed predation also enhances and maintains species diversity, and currently we know far less about the importance of seed predators relative to seed dispersers. And finally, orangutan frugivory is not entirely mutualistic or antagonistic. Orangutans disperse seeds of genera that they also predate. And these rare dispersal events of commonly predated seeds might outweigh the business costs of predation. And so in order to understand how the orangutan's dispersal role fits in with the disperser community, we compare dispersal distances with those of sympatric large-bodied seed dispersers. So wreath hornbills are widely distributed across Southeast Asia, including on Borneo, and these hornbills disperse seeds about median distances of about 1.3 kilometers, with maximum distances of about 11 kilometers. Asian elephants, while they do not occur at GP, are sympatric with orangutans throughout other parts of their distribution. And orangutans, or Asian elephants, disperse seeds mean distances of about 1 to 2 kilometers, with a maximum distance of about 6. Relatively little is known about sun bears. However, we do know they are frugivorous and they disperse seeds, particularly large seeds, and they could be dispersing seeds relatively far, as their mean home range size is about 15 square kilometers. And they're estimated to have relatively long gut passage times, maybe about 15 to 20 hours. Of the many viverras, mean dispersal distances are known for the common palm civet, and these civets disperse seeds about 200 meters on average. In a meta-analysis of macaques disperse seeds via defecation approximately 250 meters, with maximum distances of up to 1,300 meters. The macaques also disperse seeds shorter distances via seed spitting. We know from earlier that gibbons are frequent seed dispersers. White-handed gibbons disperse seeds median distances of about 140 meters, maximum of about 500 meters. So orangutan average dispersal distances of about 450 meters are longer than those of palm civets, macaques, and gibbons, and are shorter than those of Asian elephants and wreathed hornbills, and possibly some bears. So finally, orangutans are critically endangered, and Indonesia is losing forested areas at a faster rate than anywhere else on the globe. We know from previous studies that the loss of large-bodied seed-dispersing frugivores can affect forest structure. It decreases dispersal distances, decreasing seed recruitment, and increases seed predation rates. Seed dispersal is essential to preserving habitats and biodiversity. Additionally, orangutans have low reproductive rates, long interbirth intervals, and a late age at sexual maturity, meaning orangutan populations have a low ability to recover from population declines. Currently, many wild orangutans are now persisting in fragmented and degraded habitats and in human-dominated landscapes. So an important area of research would be to understand if orangutans outside of primary forests are dispersing seeds, and to consider if orangutans have a role in moving seeds among forest fragments, thereby maintaining plant gene flow and possibly restoring plant diversity. So a loss of orangutan habitats continues. It's important to identify orangutans' ecological roles, which would help us to understand the redundancy of their seed dispersal roles within the seed disperser community, and thereby the resilience of their habitats. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to acknowledge all of the following, and welcome up to any questions.
Great job, Andrea. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I think, Cheryl, do you want to monitor questions? How should we do this? Is there, maybe people have already registered on chat. Any questions? No, I think not. So I'll leave it to you.
So Andrew, maybe you should take off screen share because then you can see everybody.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Or,
There you go. Excellent. Great. And thank you all for coming today, as if coming is the right word, but attending. And please engage in the questions of dispersal and endangerment.
I guess
Yeah.
I'll just jump in. I don't know whether you want to call on people or what. I'm wondering a little bit about seeds that are indigestible in terms of them being too hard to chew, and about how how hardness of seed or diaspora in general is related to the choice to spit versus swallow, or if that has more to do with the size of the seed diaspora itself.
There hasn't been as much research on hardness of seed. Definitely seed size is a factor. I can show you one more slide here. Okay. So this is also from, maybe you can't see this, sorry. Okay, so I did look at seed size. I didn't get a chance to look at seed hardness. I do think that seed hardness would have a effect. And I'd be particularly interested in understanding if the hardness of seeds affects handling behavior among orangutan age sex classes. Because I think perhaps that's where you might see differences among like flange males chewing seeds versus particularly younger juvenile orangutans maybe not chewing seeds. We did look at seed length for about 27 morphotypes of seeds, and we found that larger seeds were spit more often, whereas smaller seeds tended to be swallowed.
And that certainly makes sense, but it seems to me that probably there's some interaction between those two variables as well, right? So like a large soft seed is going to be potentially something you swallow, but you also chew it. So, yeah, so I was interested in that. That's definitely, I think, something to maybe continue looking at. Cool.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question. So, one, I just wanted to say your figures are beautiful. Like a lot of the graphs and stuff you had, like just very clearly made your point. But I was also curious. So, seed dispersal would be in line with mass fruiting, right? Because there'd be more food available, so you would see more seeds dispersed. So is it kind of like the cyclical process as well, that like more seeds aren't getting dispersed and so the seeds aren't getting planted and so there's more limited food? Or do you think it's just completely separate? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
Yeah, so this is definitely something I'm planning to look at in one of my other chapters. And I'm thinking that there will be some sort of similar trend like you described, that there'll be more seeds dispersed during these mass fruitings where they're consuming a lot of fruit. And then during these periods of low fruit availability, they might be dispersing one or two or like a lower diversity of seeds because they're just consuming less fruit overall. But also during these mass fruitings, they might just be predating more seeds and not necessarily dispersing more.
Interesting. Yeah, the idea of like diversity of seeds is also really interesting. That'd be more of the same when it's more fallback foods.
Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. So I was wondering about the, so you said that they're spitting, so orangutans spit seeds out more than chimps.
Yeah, generally.
Yeah.
There hasn't been as much research on chimpanzee seed spitting. So chimpanzees do produce those like food wajas, which contain all the fibrous masses, and sometimes those contain seeds. But the research on that has been that they don't tend to have that many seeds or a very low diversity of seeds.
So if you looked at more, I'm just thinking about, because we think about orangutans seem like they eat a lot more seeds than chimps do, right? In general, I mean, and people think about chimps as being fleshy fruit eaters, and they're not really predating on seeds. Is that, do you have data on that too? So that, is there comparative data looking at the seed, that aspect of seed predation, and like comparatively?
There might be. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but that could definitely be something I could look into.
So I just know that there's often general statements made that, apes are ripe fruit specialists. It's like, well, chimps are ripe fruit specialists. I mean, orangutans like ripe fruit, right? But I think that maybe the seed eating amount of seeding they do is maybe not totally appreciated. So.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, I know that we have looked at ways that orangutan teeth have developed over time to open up some of these different kinds of hard to eat things. Do you think that that has any part in like maybe getting into some different seeds or fruits that other animals in the forest can't get into? Like, does that help as far as, the diversity of things that they might be able to help disperse, or are those usually things that they're predating on because they can actually get through some of the harder shells, things like that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because yeah, that's kind of like two-part. Are they getting into these big fruits through these really hard huskings, so things like durians that have the really tough parts, or are they like actually able to then predate the seeds once inside of it? And I think it's probably maybe both, that there are these giant mega fruits in the forest that maybe only have a few dispersers, and I think that would be a really interesting area of research to look at, is like, which are orangutans able to disperse these particularly really big, really hard husk fruits, and maybe the role of these like molar adaptations might have some part in this. I don't know if that fully answers your question or not.
No, totally. No, and it just makes me think too, I think your point at the end, thinking about like further research as far as their ecological role, especially in places that are fragmented or are degraded in some way. Like, I think that question just seems so important and really brings up this point of view of thinking of conservation at a ecosystem level versus just a species level, of that if we know the specific roles that these animals are playing with plants and with each other and with humans even too, that that can really kind of push the way that we think about conservation of both forest and of orangutan. So I think that's really important work. Like, I really like the implications of that.
Yeah, exactly. That would be really more interesting to look at, is when you can finally put them within the community of dispersers and understand how they're all interacting with all these different plants.
So I just want to, I think, follow up on that a little bit too. I was just wondering about like what you've done so far. Do you, like, if you had to like make recommendations to the national park or something, or about, you know, what is there anything that you would say right now that we have enough information about, like, for example, the role, you know, if you're trying to make an argument for what the role is for orangutans in, as you know, in keeping the forest going and in these fragmented habitats. I mean, one of the things kind of interesting is that when we do, just for sake of, you know this, Andrea, but for the others attending, is that in our conservation work that we do at the local, the villages and people around our study site, is that, you know, quite the number one thing people mention is that why we should protect orangutans is because they're seed dispersers. So we think that they've learned that actually from our education that we've given them, that they didn't, although we need to see if that's where that comes from. But just thinking about like what you could tell, I don't know, what recommendations you might have. And then also just thinking, the second question was just about what's next? Like, what do you think is a good follow-up once you're, I mean, this is just a portion of your PhD, your dissertation, but like, what do you think would be the next step?
Yeah, so in terms of like recommendations for the national park, we know that they disperse fruit, or that they consume a lot of fruit, and of these there is a small portion that they disperse. So perhaps in like restoring areas, trying to see particularly, I think it would be an interesting comparison to look at in these more deforested areas and potentially areas that are being reforested, comparing like plant diversity, seedling diversity, and seeing which of these plants, and if the orangutans disperse, if orangutans are in these forest fragments, and if orangutans potentially do have a role in rehabilitating these forests. And so I think, again, looking at, again, the community of dispersers, that orangutans possibly are one of the few dispersers of these large seeded fruits, particularly hard husk fruits, and that, especially I think like gibbons, while they can disperse some very large size seeds, perhaps they are more limited by the size of the fruits or the distance they can disperse these fruits. And so it would be interesting to look at things more like durians and these other, like these really big volubias and some of these others where orangutans do seem to be having this really potentially important role. And then as for like what I hope to look at maybe next, I think, again, looking at maybe, like, I know you're starting a secondary site in the Rankong, and I think looking at seed dispersal comparisons in this more secondary forest and comparing it with the primary forest. And again, looking to see if orangutans are dispersing the seeds these far distances would be a really cool follow-up project.
Yeah, definitely.
So when is the next time you might go out into the field?
That's hard to say.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah.
Yeah, right now we can't really get visas to go. I mean, foreigners can't get, well, at least I mean, you could, if you're had something critical to do there, I guess you could get a visa possibly, but we can't really get visas to go. But we're hoping at least by the spring, by not, well, first I thought the spring, now maybe summer.
Yeah, yeah. But are there people on site who are tracking and collecting more data there now?
Yeah, so do you want to answer that, Andrea? Or?
Yeah, so there's a small team of committed Indonesian researchers who are following a lot of safety protocols, and they've been slowly working at following orangutans and finding orangutans during this time.
Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the thing is one of the slides it showed Rizal, who was Andrea's counterpart student. So part of the Indonesian system is that all foreign researchers support a counterpart, and so Andrea had a great counterpart from the University of UNAS in Jakarta, and he did his undergraduate senior thesis with her and studied seed dispersal, and then he went back and finished his undergraduate thesis and graduated, and then he was perfectly primed actually to now he is our assistant manager. So he's come back and he's actually the one who's like running the research project right now. So that training that he got from Andrea sort of kicking in, because all the foreigners have come back, and we normally have our team is mostly Indonesians anyway, but now, and people are already in sort of leadership positions, but now like all the leadership positions in the country are filled by Indonesians. And so but that was Andrea did a great job sort of mentoring him as well through her dissertation.
Is there, like, I know we can't go an hour without talking about the pandemic, but is there a risk of spreading COVID to primates? Like, has there been research on how much it will spread cross species?
Yeah, so we do know that particularly primates and apes, being closely related to humans, do have a risk of contracting COVID. However, orangutans do tend to be very arboreal. They don't really come down to the ground. There's very strict protocols on maintaining our distances away from them. And so due to those kind of social distancing protocols, it seems that the risk would be relatively low. I know, Cheryl, if you have something to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that, especially, we're closely monitoring. And so we on average, we're about 30 meters from them. So looking at them to binoculars. So we're really not at all any kind of a zone where we could be sharing respiratory, but are, breathing on them. But we started wearing masks. So we wear masks when we follow now, which we didn't used to do. So we wear masks, and we also have like a quarantine for anyone going up to the station that's coming from outside. It's where we are in Indonesia. It's actually quite a low rate. It's high in Jakarta, but where we are, it's a very low rate of COVID. And so far it hasn't been in the villages. I mean, you could also say maybe their testing isn't as good, but people aren't, it's not a lot of people dying or obvious signs of disease, of having it, and no one in the villages that we know that people have come in contact has had it. So we don't think there has been that exposure. But still, we stay very far away from them. We wear masks, and then also other sort of more stringent, hand washing and other kinds of those kind of protocols too at the site. So I don't think that we're putting them at risk, basically. It is, I talked. It is interesting though. So one thing that people might be of interest to some people is that this sort of pandemic has raised the issue of sort of brought to the forefront how important it is to have like these kind of big projects, is to have local people who are running things and have that kind of training. And I just talked to a journalist last night who's doing a story on that. And then we also wrote a little piece for biological conservation on this. And I think that as opposed to lot of people's ideas about kind of this kind of research project where it's just like one person out there is doing everything, you know, that it's a very big team and mostly of people from the local area. And we've really tried to invest in that. And I think that this is, you know, shows how important that is, because if we didn't have that, then everything would have collapsed. If we didn't have this sort of highly trained people that are on site, you know, and like the conservation project, one of the managers is now the field director, and he's been working for me for like 18 years. And so I think that sort of points out that how important that is, that kind of investment for the sort of sustainability, long-term sustainability of these projects.
Any other questions?
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I think we can't avoid the pandemic questions that have to be asked about not just ongoing field work, but the future of our sites wherever they are in the world and the people we have worked with. So you know, I'm super conscious of that, not having, you know, not having the kind of site you have, but having a site that's heavily peopled, you know, with people who are very strongly affected. So, you know, we have to talk about it. It's good. Anybody else have a comment? Or I'm sure Andrea will answer questions in the future too when we've disconnected today or in the future. But I'm really glad that you began our series this fall and that you were willing to present such a wonderfully vivid picture of a very interesting small point that has big ramifications. This idea of seed dispersal is really a huge topic, and so, you know, I like the idea of extending the discussion further. If anybody else have a comment? Then I guess I will say see you next time. I think Veronica has sent out the announcements of the November and December events, and I will certainly be putting up posters, whatever means we have for putting up posters beforehand. And again, sorry for the lack of lunch and ice cream, but that will come in when it can. So thank you again. Thank you, Cheryl. And thank you all for coming around. And yeah, a beautiful job, really beautiful job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yay. Wonderful job. Thank you.
Thanks so much.